Welcome to California State University, Northridge. I'm Dr. Denise Sandoval. I'm a professor of Chicana and Chicano studies here at Cal State Northridge for 21 years. And I've also been researching, writing about, and curating exhibits about lowrider culture, primarily in Los Angeles, since 1998. And this exhibit, I'm really excited. It's called The Politics of Low and Slow. It opened October 2022. It's here until July 2023 at our university library, and it's the first exhibit in Los Angeles that tells the story of lowriding through artifacts. So the things that people collect. Most of the exhibits that I've curated in the past have focused on lowrider cars. So we sort of use the cars to tell the story of lowriding, and now we're looking at telling lowriding through artifacts and the things that people collect. So what I really wanted to do with this exhibit, and if you come, you can read the curatorial statement, but really looking at when we say lowrider culture, what does that mean? How do people make culture? How do they build community? How do they use a culture like lowriding to express their identity or to tell their American story? And so I hope when people come to this exhibit that they learn a lot, or they also feel celebrated and seen in museum exhibits, because a lot of times museums don't focus on the stories of people of color, and primarily in this exhibit, I'm focusing on Mexican American history and lowriding. My own roots, my family roots are East LA. My mom grew up right off of Whittier Boulevard, where there's been cruising since the 1950s and 1960s. So for me, and my hope is that people learn about lowriding, helps them think about questions about the world we live in, specifically around culture, and help people build community around art expressions like lowriding. So with this exhibit, we have 400 artifacts, about 7 different collections, and a lot of these artifacts are also ones that have been in my own personal library for about over 25 years. And so with this exhibit, I really wanted to start with LA history, and I thought if we're going to look at sort of Mexican American LA history, we have to start with zoot suit culture. So it was really important for me to think about how Chicanos in the 1940s began to use the zoot suit to express sort of alternative notions about what it meant to be Mexican American in that time period. Obviously, the zoot suit comes from African American culture, African American swing and jazz culture, but in the 1940s, the zoot suit was criminalized, especially around 1942, when the zoot suit was banned from being made in the city of LA. But whenever you ban something, teenagers want to wear it. And then there was the notorious zoot suit riots in 1943, where sailors came into the city because we're in the middle of World War II, and LA was a major port, and were beating up Black and Chicano zoot suiters. And so it really sort of revealed the way that, the style of Black and brown culture and how it was criminalized. Yet the zoot suit style, was embraced, right, by lowriding, and also the Lowrider magazine. Their logo is a pachuco. And so a lot of people look at the pachucos as sort of that first subculture that was both Mexican and American. So with this exhibit, is just looking at artifacts. Of course, we have a zoot suit from the very legendary El Pachuco Zoot Suit Shop down in Fullerton that had been making zoot suits since the 70s, and they rent zoot suits. But also old issues of Lowrider magazine. For me, what was really interesting is you could see in these early images how the founders of the magazine were really about incorporating history and teaching people about their history, like the zoot suit chapter in LA that you're not learning in the schools. And to me, what was really exciting is that Sunny Madrid had a section in Lowrider magazine called Lowrider Pasados, which mean lowriders of the past, and they encouraged their readers to send in old photos of their family or friends posing by their cars. And so what I thought was so great is you have images from the 40s and 50s and 60s of how cars became such a representation of American dream, right? That people wanted their cars. And I love, we don't see that anymore of in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even in my own family, families would take their portraits, Mexican American families, African American families in LA in front of their cars. And I'm sure it was like that in other cities as well. So I think what's really important is when we think about automobile history in this country, what that meant to people of color and working class people. It meant the American dream. And then car custom culture was that way of putting that individual stamp right on an American-made product, which is a car. And so in this display, I also wanted to tell the story of some of the historic lowrider car clubs in LA. We start with the Dukes, which is the oldest lowrider car club in Los Angeles, founded in 1962. They're actually birthed at a very important area that connects to our Zoot Suit chapter. They grew up in the community of the 38th Street Gang that were arrested en masse, as it's called the Sleepy Lagoon case of 1942. You could look it up. But that was their history. So for them, they always considered themselves pachucos, and they would call themselves pachucos when they would lowride. The term lowrider that comes out of the Lowrider Pride history book, they said that term was created by the police post-1965 Watts riot. So before people like from LA, they would call the Chicano lowriders would call their cars pachuco cars. And so some of the things that you see in the collection where I love is like flyers, old magazines, plaques, photos, the Dukes. One of their early first emblems, that is very different than their current one of the Dukes. And I also really love, thinking about car names and car plaques. Car plaques are so central to a lowrider car club, of marking your belonging to a club, to a community. It becomes a source of pride, right, to fly your plaque on your card. But I thought it was really interesting how the two oldest lowrider car clubs in LA, the Dukes and the Imperials, they have sort of this regal name. So like, the name choice of your car club is so telling too, right? Of like a way of sort of bringing a sense of higher class, of royalty, of elegance to your car culture as well, to your community as well. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that car clubs are like second families. One of the things I really wanted to cover in this exhibit is the professionalization of car clubs, that people don't think about how car clubs have agendas when they meet, calendars. One of the things that was amazing for me was like over here in this display case, like all these old flyers of car clubs from like early car shows, car washes. Like here you have a phone tree, an agenda, a membership of the Dukes over here. And so I thought this was really important to be thinking about, again, the professionalization of car clubs and the organization of car clubs, that if you're not in the scene, you're not aware of sort of that infrastructure that is also part of lowrider culture. And then also for me, it was important, and other things of memorabilia, like banquets, invitations, Christmas cards that car clubs send out, all these things that like for the outsider is very new. But for me, it was really important to include this art piece from Alberto Herrera that he created for the 2017 show at the Petersen that I curated on Chicano art, which was called The High Art of Riding Low. And it's an airbrush dedicated to Fernando Rueles, who was one of the founding members of the Dukes Car Club, who has passed away. Jesse Valadez, the founding member of the Imperials, who also passed away. And you have the Pachuco logo in the middle to represent Sunny Madrid, who also sadly passed away too. So to me, it was really important with this piece that people who are in the culture, like they will look at this and know that this is sort of in homage to our lowrider ancestors. So again, you could see some of the examples for this exhibit that we blew up sort of like old flyers. So I really love like where you can see some that are like really homegrown, organically done, a little bit more professionally done as well. And that again, your participation in a car club, you have the car club plaque, things like t-shirts and jackets are also something that really denote car club membership. And then also for me, it was important to teach people that lowrider car culture really emerges, post-World War II is part of that whole boom of car culture activities that we see post-World War II, but also to talk about the relationship with hot rod culture. So hot rodding really is sort of that first car culture, and it came in the 1930s. Hot rods were really about raising their car and going fast, and I always say that lowriding was the oppositional aesthetic. So lowriding as oppositional aesthetics was about lowering your car and about going slow. Again, you know, the historian in me, it's so important to sort of look at that relationship of car club and car culture history in the United States. And I think that history, lowriding, and its connection to hot rod, that, you know, still that sort of competition and that relationship, oppositional aesthetics, you know, still exists to today. But, you know, you talk to a lot of the old timers, they will talk about how in LA there were Chicano hot rodders. You know, not everybody was into lowriding, but also, again, I feel like there was a lot of tension and competition between hot rods and lowriders at the streets, you know, in car shows, or the car shows by R.J. Canning. You know, and I think even today, there's a lot of lowriders that say that, you know, lowriders inspired hot rods inspired lowriders in regards to like paint jobs, pinstriping, you know, so I feel like that tension is like a healthy tension because it sort of raises the competition for both car club scenes. The collections that we feature are based on sort of friendships and relationships I've had for close to 25 years. So it was really important to me to include my friend Mike Lopez with the Lifestyle Car Club, who builds award-winning cars, but also, you know, was part of Abraxas, and then as a young teenager, and then moved to Lifestyle. And again, you sort of see the great sort of flyers, right, and T-shirts, and you know, his world famous car, you know, was like Twilight Zone, and this was an early car of Dark Vision, and the T-shirt, you could tell it's like worn. And then also to include a very important car club for LA, USO, and USO, that was started by Kita Lilau, rest in peace, you know, sort of created and merged in the 90s as a car club that was multicultural and really embraced this idea of brotherhood. You know, USO means brother in Samoan. And so, you know, very early on in the 90s, they were one lowrider car club of the year, and they had so many different chapters, and their diversity was what they were known for, and they continue to be known for award-winning cars, but also sort of that brotherhood, right? That I think the thing about lowriding that for me is always important to teach people is that, you know, it's the love of cars, of the love of the lowrider car that brings people together and builds community and that brotherhood and sisterhood and that family as well. So this section, we, you know, also used a lot of old issues of Lowrider magazine and sort of blew up the pages because they also tell history. So I think I always teach my students that for me, you know, Lowrider magazine was the first magazine for Chicanos by Chicanos. And when you look at those early issues, you really see like the community being featured and visualized, you know, short stories, community reports about what was happening, you know, in Phoenix, or what was happening in East LA, or what was happening in San Jose. Creative writing, like short stories and poetry and art. So I feel like the first version of Lowrider magazine really was also a community history book, like we talked about with the Lowrider Pasados, a way of linking our past here in the United States as Chicanos to the present of the 70s and 80s. And so that's why I thought it was really important to include like old issues of Lowrider magazine right here. So you see how, you know, people would write in to the magazine, and you could look at some of these features and share their stories, lowrider dedications, but you really get this more homegrown element of like the first phase of Lowrider magazine. And then also again, like cruising was something that was criminalized here in Los Angeles, and it's a fight that we're still fighting here in California. Sacramento and San Jose and also San Francisco have been successful sort of bringing down the anti-cruising ordinances. It's something that we're still fighting here in Southern California. So it was important to me to think about how cruising and also lowrider culture experience sort of targeting by police, and you know, Whittier Boulevard, which was the main cruising spot in East Los Angeles, was shut down in 1979, and there was a lot of violence on the boulevard between lowriders, but also police and lowriding. And then also the car show. I think it was so great to sort of see the examples of how local car clubs would also have their own car shows. You see some of the scoring from old R.G. Canning shows. You know, obviously when you're competing in a lowrider car show, you also get trophies. And then also, this was one of my favorite photos from Lowrider magazine from Devonshire Downs car show. So here on my campus at CSUN, Devonshire Downs used to be north of our campus, and CSUN used to own that land, and they would have a lot of car shows in the 70s and 80s, and I got really excited when I found a lot of those old flyers of sort of linking sort of car shows to even our own history here at Cal State Northridge. And then also, you know, the history of Lowrider magazine. So we have sort of a photo of Sonny Madrid, who is the early founder of Lowrider magazine. The first image of Lowrider magazine, the first issue in January 1977. And you could see sort of how, you know, even the title of Lowrider was hand-drawn. An early jacket of Lowrider magazine that was gifted by Johnny Lazoya, who's an old-timer still around in Phoenix, Arizona, who, you know, was a photographer, writer, was marketing, would bring the magazine to different areas in the Southwest and try to, you know, get a market for lowriding in those communities. So you could see some of the old sort of artifacts of Lowrider magazine, like they would began putting out in their 90s like videos of their car shows. This is one of their 20th anniversary tour, as well as the history of hydraulics. You know, to me, it's also really important to look at how the culture is also visualized in popular culture. So to look at the way like Hollywood and movies have also played a big role of, you know, creating meaning of the culture. Sometimes, like, you know, you could also argue that popular culture, and specifically Hollywood, sometimes contributes to a negative image of lowriding, where they think like lowriders are gangsters on wheels. And so I feel like that's an image that's still with us. But also, again, like even just with the movies, but even the music. And so it was really important to me to feature like how music is also part of lowrider culture, and to also here in LA talk about Art LeBeau, who was a really important DJ who had his Art LeBeau oldie show for these last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, but also would put on car shows and concerts in LA for a long, long time. And he also just passed away this fall, like October. So it was really important to honor somebody who, he was Armenian American, but had such a love for like the Chicano and African American community, and like a lot of the oldies music that he played on his radio station, you know, is the same music that you sometimes hear, you know, coming out of lowrider cars. And then here in Los Angeles, you know, one of our most historic lowriders is the Gypsy Rose. So to me, you know, the Gypsy Rose is the only lowrider car that is now registered in the Historic Vehicle Car Registry. And it was given that certificate in 2017. And so, you know, everybody knows the Gypsy Rose. It's such a historic car. And I think it also captures such an aesthetic style of the 1970s. And if you've seen the Gypsy Rose, you just see how elegant, you know, the interior is, with like a chandelier, wet bar, right? Crushed pink velvet, all the beautiful roses around the outside of the car as well. So I think what's interesting is like now our cars are also getting recognition in sort of the broader car world. And so to have sort of the Gypsy Rose as a historic car in the United States, that is an important sort of new chapter for lowriding. So to me, it was really important to also include Chicano art, because Chicano artists, beginning in the 1960s, began to sort of use the lowrider car as a template to represent Chicanismo, right? To talk about Chicano pride and Chicano history. And some of the artists that really began this you know, link between the lowrider car, Chicano history, and Chicano identity were people like Gilbert Magoo Lujan, Frank Romero, and also John Valadez. And Frank and Gilbert is no longer with us, or Magoo, but we're lucky to have some original car art pieces by Frank Romero here. These cars that he did, and also his print over there of going to the Olympics, which is an actual mural that was painted for the 1984 Olympics here in Los Angeles. Sadly, it's been whitewashed in LA because it was receiving too much tagging and graffiti, which breaks my heart. But what was really important, and even the Pachuco was also embraced by Chicano artist Jose Montoya out of Sacramento. So like how these history, like the Pachuco history and lowriding, they become sort of these symbols of what it means to be Chicano, and you begin to see sort of that that pride being taken in, right, by our community, but how artists are also adding to the dialogue of how you build a culture, right, and how you sort of celebrate Chicanismo by celebrating lowriding and the Pachuco. And then also, it was really important to me to talk about the gender politics of lowriding, because people always look at lowriding as, you know, a very masculine activity, which it is, and it has that history. But women have always been a part of lowriding here in LA. You know, we had all-girl car clubs in the 1970s, like the Ladybugs, the Dukes, you know, started their own chapter, the Dukettes for women. But now what we've been seeing in these last like 6 years, 7 years, is women creating their own clubs. Women, you know, not relying to be part of sort of the historic clubs, though some of them are getting accepted in these all-male car clubs. But I love how women, I really see women as the future of lowriding and the new leaders. And so it was important for me to sort of look at the history that women have played. And even though I have to mention, like, even though women were not part of the car clubs in the 70s, a lot of them were also solo riders. So like, there's an amazing women car club scene in Central California, like Stockton, Modesto, San Jose, like the Dueñas. A lot of them, they'll say, you know, they got their lowrider cars from their moms. So their moms were like solo riders and they inherited these cars. So I think it's so really important to think about the gender politics and the role that women play in lowriding, because obviously people just tend to focus on the bikini models, which they do exist, right? Lowrider magazine put their first bikini model in 1979 to announce the first Lowrider Super Show. And of course, the editors saw that they saw an increase in profits. But even though they saw that increase, that first owners, they didn't always put women with bikinis on the cover, but that was definitely something you saw in the second phase and in the late 80s and 90s. And then also, I wanted to include some of the museums exhibits that I curated at the Petersen. So my first exhibit that I curated at the Petersen was in the year 2000, and then that was called Arte y Estilo. And then also the second show was La Vida Lowrider in 2007, and I already talked about the art show in 2017 at the Petersen, the High Art of Riding Low. And so I think for me, a lot of my interest was thinking about museums are important spaces to tell our stories, and more importantly, you know, telling our stories that represent our communities. And I think for me, it's really important for me that any work that I do, that it represents the lowrider community, that they're gonna come and feel that their story is being told authentically and accurately, and also that they feel pride, you know, that they're coming to these exhibits. And it's always great, right, you know, that people come and they learn about our culture in museums as well. And so I think, you know, museums play such an important role of, you know, validating our cultures, but we don't always have to rely on museums to tell our stories. And I love that we're living in a world now through social media where anybody in the community can use their camera, right, and tell the story of lowriding on the streets or in their neighborhood. So another part of this exhibit that was really important for me, again, of like approaching the question of what is culture, what makes culture, is talking about aesthetics. So you could definitely argue, right, that lowriding contributes a particular aesthetics of car customizing, right? The car is built low, it has hydraulics, or lowering blocks, the paint jobs, the interiors, right? When you look at that car, you know it's a lowrider, you know, not a hot rod. So another part of the aesthetics, though, is like fashion, what people wear. And I think one of the aesthetics that really has been, you know, cemented as part of lowrider culture, along with the Pachuco, has been the cholo, right? The cholo aesthetics. So everybody knows the work of Teen Angel, right? If you know your lowrider history, he worked for Lowrider magazine, edited their Lowrider Arte magazine. So what was great is that beginning in like the late 70s, early 80s, the magazine began to create a second magazine that was called Lowrider Arte that featured the art. So I love that, right? That you had sort of this quote unquote car magazine that I said that really the first issue was a community magazine, had a lot more text, you know, text and visuals, right, were pretty balanced. But then they started their own art magazine that just featured the art that the community drew. So Teen Angel, you know, was really important in that sort of world, along with Mike Pickle, who another important lowrider artist. And he also created his own magazine, Teen Angel, that again really celebrated sort of the cholo and cholo style. And so even today, you see the fashion of the chola and chola in lowrider culture. A lot of people, you go to the car shows and they're selling the hats, selling the clothing. You see the people when they come, right, and they sort of put on sort of that gear to come to a lowrider car show, and I love it, you know. And the other person that I think has also plays a big role in the culture is David Gonzalez, who created the Homies line of the little figurines, of the cholos and cholas, that I remember when it came out in the 90s, it was highly criticized as like promoting stereotype. I love that he's still creating homies. You know, every time I go to the lowrider magazine shows, you know, if he's there and he has a table, it has the longest line. So it's great how our lowrider community loves the work of David Gonzalez. So I think it's also important to sort of think about how lowrider culture sort of creates its own aesthetics, and what does culture mean, like language, music, right, magazines, that are also another way of how you sort of mark that you're part of this community. And also, to me, it was important to sort of feature sort of two important sort of what we now call cultural influencers. But back then, you know, they were just important artists on the lowrider scene, like Esteban Oriol, who really was in a very important LA and I would say American photographer, who was known for sort of like using black and white photography to tell the story of the streets. You know, worked with Cypress Hill. Him and his partner, business partner, Mr. Cartoon, have a great movie on Netflix called LA Originals that tells their story, but they started sort of with Cypress Hill. And so Esteban, you know, has really created an image and a style through his photos and his lens that I see a lot of younger folks sort of emulating. And so it was really important to me to like tell his story as an artist through artifacts. And so I have two display cases, one dedicated to Esteban Oriol, and you could see, you know, he's most well known. Obviously, his most famous image is the LA Fingers that, you know, is on t-shirts. You see energy drink cans, you know, dolls, murals. And so I think you know, when we sort of think about the culture, you have the guys who paint the cars, artists, but also people in the scene that also are important artists. And so I think Esteban's photography is so important to lowrider culture history. And today, you know, I think social media, Instagram, you know, could see Esteban and Mr. Cartoon, the way that they're also influencers. But they're also of a different generation, of our generation of Gen X, right? And then also this display case of Mr. Cartoon. And so Mr. Cartoon, tattoo artist, graffiti artist, muralist, overall artist, you get to see in this display case, you know, all the different ways that he sort of brings his aesthetics, and he's known for obviously his black and gray tattoo style, but how he takes his artistic sort of creativity and expresses himself in products, right? From t-shirts to pomade to spray cans. Most importantly, he designed special edition Nike Cortez for Nike. And so everybody sort of knows Mr. Cartoon, you know, started as an airbrush artist. And you see some of his first airbrush machines there, and then moved on to working on tattoos and also painted important lowrider cars in LA as well. He's also a member of the lowriding community and has a large collection of lowrider cars. So I feel like Mr. Cartoon is sort of this example of how you take sort of your artistic skill, creativity, and apply it to sort of the commercial world, right? And that we're living in a world that lowriding is big business, lowrider culture is big business. So people are looking at a way to sell products, but also hiring, right, artists from that community to create products that celebrate Chicano culture, celebrate lowriding as well. And then over here we have, you know, we talked about how Lowrider magazine, you know, started Lowrider Arte, but very soon they also started Lowrider Bicycle magazine to sort of celebrate, you know, an important part of the lowrider car clubs. A lot of lowrider car clubs started bike chapters for their children, and there's also just standalone bike clubs as well. So you see some of the different magazines that Lowrider Magazine created, and then some sort of challenges to Lowrider Magazine as well, like Street Low, Street Customs, and Orly's Lowriding that comes out of New Mexico. So I thought it was important to sort of think about how people were using media and creating magazines that just focused on lowriding. So we all know about Lowrider Magazine, but there were also other companies as well. And even today, I've seen the birth of a lot of new magazines on the scene, and I find it exciting because it all adds to the diversity of lowrider culture. You know how a lot of times we don't look at car shops where the real magic happens for lowriding and where cars are built, and there's just something about the smell of a car shop, right? Looking at the work that's being done that really helps you appreciate the culture. So these two display cases celebrate car shops. You know, look at hydraulics. We have the surplus World War II aircraft parts that were the original hydraulics that were put on cars, and some more custom hydraulics of the present. Also some old images from Lowrider Magazine of, like, you know, business ads of shops that were featured. And so for me, I thought it was important to sort of think about the important role that car shops also play in lowrider culture. Because we're in the San Fernando Valley, I thought it was really important to sort of feature the work of Alejandro Chino Vega at CNL Customs, you know, who is well known for his car Orgullo Mexicano, who's been out here in the Valley, building some of the best cars, and also did work on Double Trouble in Texas. So again, I think it's thinking about region. You know, Los Angeles is so vast, right? We go from the beaches all the way out here to the San Fernando Valley. So I think all of these spaces have car shops, have lowrider culture, and so it was important for me to sort of feature sort of these spaces that a lot of people don't have access to, and to sort of celebrate the car shops. One of my favorite parts of this display case was honoring Danny D, who is a very important lowrider painter who passed away of COVID in August of 2021. I interviewed him in August 1st for another project that I'm working on for the Smithsonian. We're building hopefully a traveling exhibition of lowrider culture with focus on photos. And so I was able to get his oral history in August of 2021. And so I thought it was important to sort of feature Danny D and, you know, to mark his contribution to the culture. And I think this is an important part to sort of talk about. In all the years that I've been doing this research since 1998, I've lost a lot of my friends, you know, as I've mentioned, and I think this is why I think it's so important to tell our stories for our communities, because these stories are so important. They're so important in history. Like somebody like Fernando Ruelas from the Dukes, he always saw lowriding being this big, how it is today. And so I know he and people like Sonny and people like Danny D and, you know, Jesse Valadez, you know, they're smiling down at us because lowriding is, and the culture is at such a level right now that I've never seen in all the years that I've been doing my research and going to car shows and just, you know, in the culture. So car shops, again, you know, play a very important role in lowriding, but also, again, when we think about culture, is thinking about how our culture also moves. So I think one of the spaces that it was important for me to look at was Japan. You know, Japan has been part of the lowriding community since like the late 80s, early 90s. Lowrider Magazine, you know, had Lowrider Japan Magazine, and in fact, how I sort of got into this research is I found an issue of Lowrider Japan Magazine in 1997. And that's the magazine that really kicked off this research for me, because when I opened up the magazine, I saw all these Japanese guys dressed like cholos and homeboys, and I was like, is this East LA? Oh no, this is Japan. So to me, it became fascinating to think about how Chicano culture is being celebrated in Japan. And I was a grad student at the time, and of course, back then, you had to start your research in a library. I went to the library, found no books on lowriding, found a couple of academic articles. So right away I knew that this was an important story, particularly for me. You know, my family, like I said, is from East LA. Dad grew up in Lincoln Heights. So for me, I knew early on that, like, you know, lowriding was a way that Black and Chicanos, we use the cars to sort of tell our story. Black Chicano lowriders, we use the car to tell our American story. It's part of LA history, and to me that was important to also document those voices and the culture from those past generations. So I think Japan, has been part of the lowriding community for a long time, but they're also such innovators, such craftsmen, they're building amazing cars. And I know some of my lowrider friends out here in LA will say like, oh my God, Japan is building their competition. So I feel like, there's just some people that recently are thinking, oh, this is a new thing in Japan, but Japan goes back to like the 80s and 90s, and Esteban Oriol and Mr. Cartoon were there in the 90s, doing tattoos. Esteban was taking photos, and so I thought it was important to sort of capture that history and talk about how I think lowriding, we see lowriding, in places like Spain or in Brazil, Japan. So it's so interesting that something that started here in the United States is getting transported to other countries, and they're making new meaning of what it means to be a lowrider. Yes, they're using our language and our aesthetics, but they're also adding to the conversation of what it means to be part of the lowrider culture, but also of the lowrider family. So another part of this exhibition, if you get to check it out, was really important for me to include art, and not just the art that's being created in the lowrider community, but art that's on canvases that's inspired by the culture. And so as I talked about earlier, Frank Romero is a really important Chicano artist that was sort of using the lowrider car and continues to use the lowrider car in his artwork. And this is a print that is inspired by his mural going to the Olympics. So you could see sort of how he sort of takes the lowrider aesthetics in the car and creates this other vision of Chicanismo and of beauty, and I think of really capturing the vida and the Corazón that also is a part of the culture. And it's also important to note that Sonny Madrid, the founder of Lowrider magazine, was very much inspired by the Chicano art community, and particularly a magazine that started out here in LA called Gonzafos. That was a collection of art and poetry and writing, and it was a way, again, of Chicanos telling their story in their community from a creative, sort of artistic standpoint. And so Sonny Madrid was really inspired by the work of Gonzafos and thought, what if we do the same with lowriding, right? That we have a magazine that, yes, features cars, but also has the community history and has creativity, like short stories and poetry. And so I thought it was really important. A lot of people don't realize that connection between sort of the Chicano movement, Chicano art movement, to lowrider history. Like down here in Los Angeles, a lot of the old lowrider car clubs like the Imperials and the Dukes were putting on car shows on university campuses like for Mecha, UCLA, or East Los Angeles College, and I mentioned sort of Cal State Northridge as well. So I thought it was really important for me in this exhibit, as somebody who's a Chicano studies professor, really believes in sort of social justice and our culture as important ways to sort of tell our American stories, to also think about that link that lowrider history has to Chicano movement history and Chicano art history as well. So part of this exhibit was also including sort of original artwork by some younger generation of Chicano artists, and we do have some OGs as well. And I really love these pieces by the Perez brothers, who are amazing artists out here in LA, who use photorealism. So when you look at their pieces, you think you're sort of looking at, photos, but it's art. And it reminded me a lot of the work of the artist John Valadez, who also is a photorealist. So when you sort of look at these pieces, you really see these snapshots that really capture lowrider culture, like the hydraulics competitions, just lowriders gassing up, right, on a Sunday night on a local cruise. So I feel like artists, play such an important role in sort of like not just documenting a culture and celebrating a culture, but elevating our meaning of what we think about lowrider culture. And like I said, Chicano artists were some of the first of sort of using the car as an icon, as a symbol of Chicanismo. And so I think artists are also part of that conversation. And we also have a piece here of saluting the Gypsy Rose. by Leanne Alrod Rodriguez, who's from LA, but also she's based in the Bay Area now. And she created this piece in homage to the Gypsy Rose. So I think it's great because you see a lot of artistic sort of referencing of the Gypsy Rose as iconic. And again, that nostalgia that comes with sort of marking sort of a style or aesthetics that when you look at that car, you're like, oh, that's very 70s. But I see that now in the present of this revitalization of sort of that lowriding style of the 70s is really big now in the culture. It was also important to sort of to create sort of here in our library, we have a reading room. So what you see on these walls are original art pieces created by some younger artists, some of them never sort of featured. So we have sort of a work of different artists' interpretation of the culture, right, and the community of lowriding. What I really, really hold dear is that a lot of these artists right now that are important on the scene down here in LA, and I would argue throughout our communities, are women artists. So I feel like another way that women are making their voices heard through their art is here, right, on a lot of art walls in our communities and gallery spaces. So it was important to me to also feature women artists. So you could see sort of here in the artwork on the walls, like different artists' interpretation of lowrider culture or the politics of low and slow, which is the title of this exhibit. All these pieces are amazing. When some to highlight is this piece by Rick Ortega that is a beautiful celebration of Compton David that people know sort of on the scene. So he did really a amazing fine art portrait. This piece right here was done by my former student, Wenceslao Queiroz, who's an important muralist, artist, and he actually graduated from Cal State Northridge here in our art department, and he painted this beautiful piece in Boyle Heights of a lowrider car, in black and white ink with, you see a little bit of the color right on the road. And then also over here, highlighting sort of two women artists. This is Oni, and what I love about Oni's art, and we have one of her portraits on the women in lowriding part where she painted herself. I forgot to talk about that, so maybe you can show the viewers that piece. But she painted herself in a lowrider culture scene. And here she sort of painted sort of the Aztec calendar. You have the lowrider car, and it's called Our Roots Run Deep. So I think, again, what's really important for me is thinking about how a lot of times people in their stories that they tell in their cars, like, yeah, we talked about that connection to the Pachucos, but even there's a long history, really in the late 20th to 21st century of including sort of Aztec imagery and Aztec history that, again, really celebrates our Chicano identity, which was about sort of connecting our roots, to our indigenous roots of Mexico as well. And so you see that celebrated also in lowrider culture, and you see sort of that aesthetics also on lowrider cars as well. And Oni sort of chose sort of the Aztec calendar, right, and putting it with a lowrider car. This piece by Jacqueline Valenzuela is she took a fender out of a 1980s mini truck, and she painted a portrait of herself in her car club, which is called Prophets LA. And I love it because this image is just painted on the piece of car like a canvas, so it's not clear coated. So it really looks like a fine piece of art, and I love it. And I love all the chips. When I brought it in here, I was like, oh my God, there's little chips. And she goes, oh no, that was like that, and I like that. So it kind of has sort of that organicness to it. It was important to also feature sort of like the photography of Oscar Castillo, who was a photographer at Consafos magazine. He's an OG. He shot a lot of photos of the Chicano movement, but he also loves lowriding, and so he takes pictures of lowrider cars, but then he creates like original like art pieces out of them, right? And he adds characters, he changes colors, and so I love, again, sort of how photographers and artists, they give us a point of view of their world, and somebody like Oscar is also adding this creativity and artistic side to his photos as well. And the artist Luis Genero Garcia, he's from down here in Southern California, but he teaches art at Sacramento State. And I love the pieces that he creates because he takes old newspapers and creates a collage, and then he paints a car on top of them. And so we have one of his prints, that's actually my print of the piece he created in homage to the Zoot Suit. But like, here's an example of sort of highlighting the Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, you know? And so you sort of have to look at the car, but also the story that's being told in sort of the pieces of LA Times that he uses. So I feel they're really political pieces, and again, make that connection to that previous generation of Chicano artists and how they're using still lowriding, but also talking about issues that are happening today in our communities. And then also it was important for me to include like an OG. So this is OG Abel, who is well known on the lowriding scene, you know, has painted lowriders, important artist, has his own company. And so he created this original piece playing on a loteria card. And so if you're Mexican, you know, loteria is Mexican bingo. So he created sort of cards, 2 cards that were inspired by lowrider culture. And so he has the OG Catrín, and then there is a card on loteria called La Dama, or the lady, and so he has her there. And I love that he has them coming off the cards. So I feel like, you know, with the art, we wanted to just make sure to include the way that artists are also part of the culture, and how they also are playing such an important role in taking our culture to galleries and museums as well. Since we're here in the library, I thought it was important to also include some early books that look at lowriding. So we have some art catalogs on lowrider culture from New Mexico, a catalog from the first exhibit that I did in Arte y Estilo in 2000 at the Petersen, and some catalogs from Esteban. So I feel that now we're sort of living in a period where there's more books, more documentation, more documentaries, just more emphasis on celebrating the culture and telling the story. But I think essentially when we sort of think about the politics in low and slow, you know, we also have to think about, yes, it's a way that people are building community, telling their American story, using their cars to express their identity. And the other part of just the beauty of the aesthetics of the culture and the craftsmanship. So we couldn't move cars into this library, but we decided how would people get to see sort of the amazing paint jobs? And so we have lowrider bicycles, pedal cars, and strollers, so that people could at least see the fantastic paint jobs and really get a sense of just how beautiful the aesthetics is of lowrider culture, and again, celebrating sort of the craftsmanship of the build. And then we also have, to end with, of just again looking at sort of, these are art objects, right? But they also function in the culture as well. We have also Chino sort of created like this original art piece for the 2017 exhibit at the Petersen, The High Art of Riding Low, and I love it because you're taking sort of elements that are featured on a lowrider car, but like creating an art piece out of it. And like, here's like the airbrush machine, it's completely engraved, right? And then again, like the hoods that a lot of times the guys have at car shops that they use as sort of their business card or calling card, right? To tell, I could paint like a style like this. So, you know, I hope that when people come to this exhibit that they learn a lot about lowrider culture, and I would love to invite everybody down to Cal State Northridge. What's great is this exhibit is free. It's open to the public. You just have to check when the library is open. It's on the 2nd floor, and if you visit, it's free, but you might have to pay for parking because we do have a season parking lot that charges. I think it's like $7. But I hope you've enjoyed this tour and learned a little bit about what I do as a historian, but also about, you know, the vitality that I believe exists in lowrider culture, and to me is not just celebrated in this exhibit, but it's celebrated every day in our community.